right, everyone, we're gonna get started. Welcome to our session, Beyond Incrementalism, Disruption at Scale. This is our third event in our series called Radical Reimaginations for Climate Justice. Let me introduce myself. I'm Ana Baptista, and I'm an assistant professor of practice here at the New School and also an associate director at the Tishman Environment and Design Center housed here. And before I joined the New School, I worked for over a decade in my hometown of Newark, New Jersey, for a local group called Ironbound Community Corporation, where I did environmental justice advocacy and activism. And most of my research and practice is really focused on working with community-based environmental justice organizations on climate justice policies, land use, and zero waste tools and cumulative impacts policies. So I'm really excited to be in conversation today with our guests. But before we get started, I wanted to give a little bit of context as to why we're holding these events. A few years ago, the Northlight Foundation approached the Tishman Environment and Design Center and my colleague Sujatha at the Social Movements Innovation Lab about potentially investing in a leadership program that targeted the EJ movement specifically. And we first conducted a landscape assessment, really reaching out to EJ movement leaders across the country about their work and their priorities, and learned a lot about the potential direction that a fellowship program could take. We also borrowed insights from social movement literature that suggested that one of the key elements for successful, productive social movements is the need for contentious tactics and really the ability to disrupt the status quo. And so we decided to center the program's design on contentious strategies that have the real potential to catapult real transformative change for climate justice beyond incremental strategies. And we know we still have a lot of gaps in our knowledge, and questions about the frameworks and that go into designing this fellowship. So this is how we decided to sort of create a space here through these series of discussions with leaders and movement activists to be in conversation with us and one another around these intersections for change and what would really be impactful and relevant for the EJ leaders in such a program. So today's discussion is really about the issue of scale and the scale of disruption needed to tackle global systems of oppression and exploitation and climate change. So that's where we're gonna enter into the conversation. And before I introduce the speakers, I wanted to give a quick rundown of the format for the 2 hours we'll be together today. So really quickly, we are going to be dividing up the 2 hours into 3 parts. The first will be sort of a moderated conversation with our guests. And then we'll have a chance in part 2, we'll have a little break, 5-minute break. And then in part 2, we'll have a chance to continue the conversation in breakout rooms. And then we'll come back together in the final part to end with a short Q&A and some final insights. All right. So I'm going to introduce our guests today now. We're very honored to have with us Jaren Brown, who is the organizing director at Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. Jaron joined GGJ in 2015 and has been building out the GGJ's just transition, climate justice, and anti-militarism campaigns, including support for the Climate Justice Alliance's Our Power campaign. Jaron has organized several international delegations in coordination with global movement allies and was the co-author of a report called We Are Mother Earth's Red Line, Analyzing the Impacts of the Paris Climate Agreement. Jaron has also worked with GGJ members organizations to coordinate a series of just transition assemblies and strategy labs throughout the US in places like Detroit and Mississippi, and was previously an organizer for Power and Causa Justa for nearly 13 years, building the power of working class Black and Latino communities in the Bay Area. So welcome, Jaren. We also have with us Dr. Leah Temper, who is a transdisciplinary researcher specializing in environmental, climate justice, political ecology, and ecological economics. She's currently a research associate at McGill University in the Department of Natural Resources And Leah's research really analyzes conflict over land and resources and how movements for environmental justice organize towards social transformation. She's the co-founder and director of the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice, EJ Atlas. Some of you might be familiar with this digital platform that has documented almost 3,000 cases of ecological conflicts around resource extraction and waste disposal. And she's the author of many scholarly and research reports that center on the transformative power of global grassroots EJ conflicts, with more recent articles like Blocking Pipelines and Settling Environmental Justice from Rights of Nature to Responsibility to Territory. And her most recent project analyzes case studies from 8 countries of transformative community responses to extractivism and alternatives born from resistance. So very timely and relevant to our conversation today. So we're gonna jump right in with Leah and Jaren to talk about scale and disruption. So I'd like to start first by having you each describe a bit about the work that you do and the perspectives that you bring into this conversation about the power of contention in terms of grassroots global responses to climate justice. Maybe we can start with Jaren and a little bit about your perspectives in your work.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here and be part of this series, and really looking forward to getting a chance to hear from the folks who are here participating and part of this conversation and process that New School is gathering. So I come to this conversation as a part of a national alliance called the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. And I think today, you know, when we're talking about disruption at scale, part of why I think Leah and I were brought into the conversation is because of the question of internationalism and how much the idea of struggling around the front line, again, you know, from the front lines of the climate crisis is very much so a struggle that's very interconnected. So Grassroots Global Justice Alliance is rooted in the struggles of frontline communities in North America. We were founded by groups like the Indigenous Environmental Network, the Southwest Workers Union, CAV, the Power, the group that I came out of, the Jobs with Justice, but a number of different frontline communities. And at that point, when we were founded, it was really coming out of the context around, you know, the issues that were already sort of circling. So I think just to say, like, you know, when we were born, as an organization, it was following the context of NAFTA and the birth of the Zapatista movement in 1994, the uprising in 1999 around the Battle of Seattle and the World Trade Agreements kind of coming into conflict, and then the World Social Forum process starting in 2003 and 2005. And so the organizations that I named, they wanted to participate in the World Social Forum process in Porto Alegre and in Brazil. And they wanted to go not just representing their local struggles, but to be representing a fabric of a sector of organizing inside North America. And they went as the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance delegation to the Social Forum. And from that, they decided to birth this alliance. So I think in that way, some of the perspective that I bring probably mirrors those who've been a part of the earlier conversation, from the representatives of the Climate Justice Alliance and other key forces, that we represent part of like a translocal power building strategy of very locally rooted communities that are dealing with the impacts of extractivism from coal, from oil, fracking, incineration, and who are building direct campaigns to protect their own land, health, water, communities, and also building alternatives. And so for GGJ, part of what we bring to that mix is an understanding of how we are connected to those similar struggles around the world. So we're very connected to movements like La Via Campesina of food producers around the world, groups like Copin in Honduras, Berta Cáceres, so, you know, this well-known land defender, indigenous land defender from the Lenca people, and making those connections that recognize that, you know, there is actually a global movement on the front lines of the climate justice struggle. And those of us who are in that frontline struggle in North America belong to that movement. We are part of it, especially when we're in deep relationship with one another. So I think that might be the starting point, I would say, around sort of some of the perspective we're bringing into this. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there and kind of pass to Leah.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's an honor to be here and so great to be talking to you both and looking forward to discussing with everybody here. So I guess, well, my personal trajectory is also, becoming involved in activism during also the kind of alter globalization movements and involved in direct action at that time. And from there, deciding to go back to school and study economic history, saying, well, if we want to dismantle this economy, we have to, I wanted to learn how it was created to deconstruct it. And through that, I began studying a master's in economic history. And that's when I discovered ecological economics and political ecology. So ecological economics is a sort of radical, heterodox alternative to economics that, just looks at the economy as being embedded within the natural world and within the ecosystems, and is really committed to, radically changing and transforming the economic system. And from there, I began working with, the environmental justice movements and the frontline resistance movements that are confronting the current economic system. So we began working together with different organizations, working in documenting together with frontline communities that had been, documenting these environmental justice struggles, global environmental justice struggles over the last 20, 30 years. This includes organizations like Oil Watch International, World Rainforest Movement, GRAIN that works together with Via Campesina. So they had been doing this work for the past 20, 30 years, but always working in different thematic areas or in different regional areas. And we saw the need to bring these struggles together and show sort of the globalized nature, as Jaron says, that, there is this global environmental justice movement, and we wanted to highlight these voices and bring them together into a global platform. And that was the birth of the Global Environmental Justice Atlas. So the idea was that this activist knowledge, kind of knowledge created through struggle of how to contest, top-down development, extractive projects, we could gather it in one place in a way to highlight voices that are mostly silenced and invisibilized, not really very heard from, and also to sort of create a global platform and network between them. So that was almost 10 years ago. The Atlas has been now been collecting these stories of struggle and documenting these conflicts for almost 10 years. And as time goes on, I think it's interesting because originally we were able to capture some of the most emblematic and well-known stories of struggle, but we had a lot of blank spots. And there are places where, you have movements, but due to repressive regimes, due to a lack of, transnational linkages, they're not very well known. So over time, we've actually put more and more energy into reaching those sort of uncharted places on the map, and to capture also those voices. So that's an intro to some of the work we've been doing in the Atlas. And I'd say that the work is within this realm of scholar activism. So we are, the work is based in the university. But we also support different actors with campaigns. We create featured maps that, involves bringing groups working, all impacted by the same corporation together. For example, in creating different featured maps or on different thematic issues, always working in alliance with the communities on the ground.
Well, thank you. I think we're going to pick up on that sort of the mapping, this idea of a mapping these global conflicts, and in a discussion of scale, right? The title of our talk today is about scale, and one of the first things you both asked me was, well, what do you mean by scale? And so I'm going to turn it back over to you all and ask both of you to interrogate or give us some examples or frameworks to help people contextualize what we mean by scale, not just geographic, in terms of the scale of movement efforts that it's going to take to really have a global impact, and what you think of when you think of the context of the movement folks you work with or that you're mapping in the EJ Atlas. If you can talk a little bit about what you think of when you think of scale for movement impact. With that, Jaren, you want to?
Sure. Yeah. I think I think it was a great question that you're bringing to the map, especially to the moment, especially because of the political moment we're in right now. The conjuncture, as we talk about it, of the COVID crisis, of the fires here. I'm in California. The orange sky we've been dealing with, the floods we've seen, and conditions around the world. And I think the essence, the power of being in this movement that's willing to talk about the issue of the survival of the planet and the relationship to Mother Earth, of living systems, is that it does call into question the entire system that we're living in. The essence of it. I think nothing lays bare more the destructive nature of global racial capitalism than the climate crisis. It's clear that this isn't about changing from fossil fuels to wind alone. Yes, we have to talk about fossil fuels, absolutely and fundamentally, but we have to look at the entire nature of the system we're living in. And I think that's really what the change at scale looks like. And when we were talking about this talk and the significance of it happening today on 9/11, it really brings in Chile, because this last year, obviously 9/11 also having tremendous significance for all of our peoples in New York. And I recognize this day has impacted many people, but also is the 47th anniversary of the coup in Chile, and the significance of the movement that happened this year in relationship also to the climate talk that was going to be happening, that was canceled for happening in Chile because of the massive uprising of peoples against neoliberalism. And that is the profound scale of change I think we're really looking at, is that we have to really be willing to take into account the entire nature of what our economy is built around. And right now, an economy built around profit, built around extractivism, developed off of the backs of colonialism, that's what comes into question. And so I think the kind of generative frameworks at scale are talking about, for example, an economy that's built around life. And that slogan I take from two movements that we work very closely with. The movement of people affected by dams in Latin America talks all the time about, water is for life, energy is for life, it's for peoples. And if we look at that as a framework, and I think the other movement that we take that from is the World March of Women, and they've been talking to us so much about feminist economy, and the idea of feminist economy, again, centering life, valuing living systems, and indigenous worldviews that again look at our relationship as part of also the rights of Mother Earth, the rights of nature itself. And I think those are the frameworks that are at scale fundamentally shifting in the kind of ways we need to move, and not just theoretically. I think practically, when we look at then the youth, the student movement, I just lift up Chile as this example to maybe then pass to Leah here. Was built on very practical conditions, right? Like students who were dealing with fare increases to get their access to school, and fare increases in the transit system. But in that strike against those conditions, because of the kind of conscious leadership that existed in the movements, the many movements in Chile, was translated into this powerful demand to say we demand a whole new constitution that's built through popular assembly. And then that militant action of taking over the Plaza de Italia and transforming it into the Plaza de la Dignidad, I think we see that echoing in different ways, similarly to the way Standing Rock echoed out deeply and fundamentally around this question of the strength of the Standing Rock Sioux Nation, holding up water as life, and speaking, to something that gathered over 280 tribes and nations, and all of our different movements were changed fundamentally from that. And I think that's the kind of scale of impact that we're seeing coming from our popular movements. I'm passing it to you, Leah.
Yeah, Leah, do you want to add anything about scale from what you've seen in terms of mapping these sorts of contentions and movements across the globe?
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to understand scale. I think when we're thinking about EJ, one way to think about scale is really, moving from this, at the level of the body, up to, the level of the atmospheric commons. And I think it's important to think about EJ in this very embodied way. There's actually, a lot of work happening in Latin America, different feminist activists that are talking about my body is the first territory. So how do we actually see our bodies as territories? How do we understand how different racialized, gendered bodies are differentially impacted through toxic activities, through extractive activities? And this is something, of course, that in the current moment that's become really, really clear with the COVID crisis. And we see how racialized bodies are impacted and how different across age structure, gender, people are not impacted in the same way. So I think it's bringing forward a lot of global consciousness regarding these differential impacts for climate and environmental justice as well, we can hope. So from the level of how these sorts of activities touch us in our bodies, we're moving up across levels. And I guess then the big question, of course, is, well, we all share these global commons. With climate justice, the atmospheric commons is one of the most important spaces. And how do we really understand how we share these spaces in a just way? And what are the different institutions, rules of distribution, rules of representation that we can have to understand justice in these shared spaces? So some of the frameworks that we use for discussing questions of justice for the atmospheric commons and the global commons, we talk about ecological debt. So the question of, who owes who, what sort of responsibilities do we each have? What does that mean for how we organize and what type of solutions we should work towards? Who's taking up what type of environmental space? And, different solutions can lead sometimes to certain, so-called solutions lead to actually the occupation of even more environmental space by the same actors as always. And this also brings up, of course, questions of historical responsibility and then sharing space also with future generations. So this temporal responsibilities. So those are, I think, some of the scalar questions that we can bring up. Time scales, geographical scales, and scales from the personal outwards.
Great. I think, I don't know if this connects sort of also to the idea of contention too, and the idea that contention and conflict at these different scales can be productive and is important for social movements in many ways. And, it'd be great to hear any reflections that you all have about from the GGJ member groups or the social movement actors that you all are working with, what is it that they're fighting against or trying to disrupt? And who are their targets? And what are the approaches to contention that you've seen among the social movement actors that you're actively in conversation with, to give people a better sense of why conflict is so important and so central to the work that's happening at various different scales. And who wants to start with it?
I don't know. Actually, we could switch it up if you
Leah, you want to
I can
pick up where you left off.
So, I mean, for us, yeah, like often doing this work, people will often have this reaction of saying, "Oh, this is very, how do you cope? This must be very depressing, studying this type of environmental injustice all the time." And often we say, or I'll answer, in some ways, I find the work that's happening really inspiring because, it's the first step of transformation is, first of all, this development of this oppositional consciousness of saying, no, another way is possible, another life is possible, and I don't need to be polluted, that I don't need to accept the status quo. So the fact that, all these movements begin to stand up and say no to, a development model that is, seen to be the only path forward or projected as sort of the only path, the only future possible, we see it as inspiring, and that's sort of the first step in the process of transformation. So that's part of the way that we see conflict as, positive. Regarding, do you want me to go on about how we kind of contention and disruption, or shall I pass it to you, Jaron, and then we can...
Yeah, did you want to add anything or ask Leah anything about that that point about contention as inspiring?
And I know I resonate with that idea a lot. I think that yeah, I mean, I think it's true what you're saying around that in so many ways, it's, there's tremendous power that we've seen in even the what seems almost impossible in terms of the kind of some of the targets that folks are up against. And I guess what came to mind as you were talking about that, I know you're situated in Canada, and I know that Wet'suwet'en, kind of came to mind as like this incredible courage, incredible conditions, and just the strength and like the determination of, I think, Indigenous-led, largely women-led, frontline struggle that then, sort of captured that sense of like people who are willing to just, stand for their own lands and bring the question of Indigenous sovereignty to all of North America, this fundamental question of colonialism. So that was what came to mind as you were speaking to me as like one of those inspiring moments, like lifts up. But yeah, I don't know if you're mid-thought, definitely continue, and then I can share some of the things that come up as things we're trying to interrupt as well.
Yeah, well, it's great that you mentioned the Wet'suwet'en, and that's, for those who aren't familiar, this was right before the COVID pandemic. Actually, there was they've been now for about 10 years being reoccupying their traditional territory, trying to stop about 7 different pipeline projects that are projected to go through their territory. And earlier this year, at the beginning of the year, the RCMP, the Canadian Royal Mounted Police, entered their territory, tried to push the pipeline through, and in response, Indigenous communities across Canada answered their call, began setting up blockades across the country, and under the hashtag Shut Canada Down. and railroad traffic was halted for about 2 weeks, including passenger traffic from east to west in Canada. And it really prompted a national discussion about this pipeline development in the country in a way that had not happened in that scale before. And I mean, I think part of what was so interesting at the time is they would have these, they would, you know, publish these polls saying 50% of the population doesn't support the Wet'suwet'en, and or 50 would be like 55% doesn't support them. And I would, my thought was, well, we have almost 50% of the population that is in favor of this level of disruption, of shutting the country down, because they're not in favor of the route that we're taking, of the path that we're taking, building this type of extractive project. So there is really widespread support. And I think the other important thing to mention about their struggle is that they're a struggle of resistance, but part of the reason they so inspiring and capture the imagination is that really the way they're also putting in place systems of healing of the colonial legacy. So in the camp space, they have, for example, a healing lodge where, you know, they're working on the trauma of colonization, the trauma of residential schools, and trying to, you know, work with communities on missing and murdered Indigenous women, work on permaculture gardens, work on energy alternatives. So they have an action camp every year, and they've been creating and exposing people to these alternative and healing spaces. So I think when you talk about what are some of the most, you know, powerful ways to disrupt, it's not only with this kind of, in social movement theory, if we think about standard disruption, which is what was happening at that time, which means, you know, you're disrupting business as usual, you're disrupting capital accumulation, you're disrupting economic flows, and saying we're not going to allow the system of accumulation at our expense to keep on running. We're really going to stop it through physical means. But at the same time, you're also disrupting the imaginary. You're also doing that cultural work of creating these new imaginaries. And I think that's a great example of how they were contributing to that as well.
That's amazing. Thank you for bringing all of that detail into what the resistance movement is built there. It's incredible. The only other piece I wanted to add in terms of this question of, you know, what are we, you know, up against in terms of targets and interruptions, disruptions, as well as kind of what we're building for. I do think a key piece we have to understand in the climate movement is also there is, unfortunately, a corporate capture of the kind of official green movement as well. There is a green capitalism out there, and that's so on the one hand, we're sort of dealing with you know, these very clear naked extractivist corporations, and we're confronting ExxonMobil, you know, that the whole, you know, the pipelines, the tar sands, you know, that aspect. But then the other aspect that we're dealing with is the kind of bringing back in the picture the neoliberal framework that unfortunately creates a lot of smoke and mirrors and a lot of confusion out there. And so I think that in terms of in the global climate movement, we have to keep in the picture, we all are also needing to disrupt the market mechanisms, the kind of dynamic of cap and trade, and some of the ways where if you have a capitalist system that is built around, look, we are trying to keep this engine going, we have these investments, this is our core priority, then what they've come up with is a system to try to say, well, look, we can just offset this, you know what I mean? And these same actors that we're targeting that are driving extraction, you know, if you go to the UNFCCC COP meetings, you will have a wall of the corporate sponsors that include all of the most extractive companies in the world, and sort of like the champion, the polluters are upheld as the champions, you know, and they're saying, well, look, you know, every time you get on a plane and it has a little sticker that says, you know, you're saving the planet by taking this flight because they're planting X number of trees in indigenous territories. That aspect, we absolutely have to disrupt it. And unfortunately, the term that we've been using for it, which is an imperfect term in our movements, we talk about it as false solutions. And I think it confuses people because we use the word solutions in there, but it really is greenwashing. It's taking these dirty extractive industries and trying to paint them clean. And that includes dams, it includes nuclear power, and it absolutely includes also carbon capture and sequestration, a lot of the kind of science that's out there that's trying to just keep the system going, and it definitely includes these market mechanisms. So I think one of the challenges of our movement is we have to disrupt that green capitalism, but part of how we're doing it, I think, is through the kind of direct action, sort of keep it in the ground movements that Leah is speaking to. And then I think also putting forward the real solutions that we see in visions like just transition, that I think we're going to keep talking more about in these 5 sessions. We just put out a document that we'll make sure to share with folks here called the People's Orientation to Regenerative Economy, that was put out by a set of forces from It Takes Roots and the United Frontline Table for a Green New Deal, but frontline movements that have a clear way of saying, like, look, we actually do have models of doing this fundamentally differently, but also disrupting the idea that you can keep burning the planet and somehow offset that. So it is moving back to that system change approach.
Yeah, I want to keep going on that example that you gave, and maybe get a little bit more conversation on the building the new, the alternatives, the reimagining what's possible, making the impossible possible. I hear both of you sharing these stories, not just of resistance, but how resistance is wrapped up in also the forward movement that grassroots groups are trying to build. So I wondered if you could share, you know, any other examples of sort of the more exciting or radical strategies or most successful strategies that you're seeing out in among your partners in the world that are, you know, building the new, that are building the alternatives, and also any failed strategies. You know, we don't talk a lot about what doesn't work, and sometimes we can learn just as much from the strategies that don't work as we do from the ones that are working. But, you know, in thinking about really disrupting systems and thinking of forward looking, what do you all see on the horizon that's promising?
So yeah, there's a lot of inspiring movements, and I think it also is useful for helping us think about disruption in more creative ways. I mean, for example, one kind of form of mobilization that's been growing a lot in Latin America and become really popular is the creation of local popular referenda on different mining projects, for example. So what there's been many locally organized votes where they say, you know, we're going to take democracy into our own hands. And that, sort of organization leads to new forms of political engagement and has been really successful in stopping multiple mining projects that were rejected by the local communities based on vote. So that's also a form of disruption through reclaiming democratic systems. I think the other thing that also has been really productive is this recreation of the commons and reclaiming of the commons of many movements. One movement that has really captured the imagination, and I think it's fairly well known internationally, is the case of the ZAD in France. It's called the Zone à Défendre. It's a fascinating case because there was for about 40 years, there was an airport projected to be built near Nantes in France. And originally it was being opposed by farmers and, rural people. So it was an agrarian movement. And in the past 10 to 20 years, climate justice activists have also, joined to that agrarian movement. And they've begun sort of reclaiming this large territory and turning it into a commons, and collectively organizing and managing the land. And that was a successful struggle. So the airport was recently canceled last year, although the struggle continues. The French state is still trying to evict them because, the creation of this sort of utopias can be dangerous, as we said, in regards of capturing the imaginary of what's possible. But, it led sort of to hundreds of groups across Europe setting up their own spaces that they call ZAD. ZAD is Zona Défendre. So it's a space that we're defending. And it kind of shows how do we create these sorts of occupations where we can create commons and new collective democratic systems for managing these commons collectively. So I think there's many, many examples of these sort of ZAD spaces as examples. And then there's also, of course, all these movements of energy sovereignty. So creating people's-led and people's-managed energy projects, sometimes, separate from resistance movements and sometimes within them. So, even in the tar sands in Canada, you have Indigenous movements that are starting solar projects. And so this, in some cases, it's, creating the alternatives within the resistance movements. And there's also, a lot of inspiring movements of alternatives. I would recommend there's a new initiative called the Tapestry of Alternatives that is kind of based on an Indian initiative called the Vikalp Sangam, which means confluence of alternatives. And it's been operating for many years now. Coordinated by a group called Kalpavriks, who was the director. Ashish Kotari worked with me on this, the recent research project. And they've been bringing together these alternative movements from all across India. And now they have this global project. So in issues like agrarian, energy sovereignty, food sovereignty, alternative education, alternative health movements. So the kind of diversity of these movements is beautiful and inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that very much so resonates with the strategies that we're most invested in within GGJ and within It Takes Roots. And I think that where we tend to talk about it, which I think has been a theme again throughout the 5 sessions of this series that New School is hosting, but we talk about it as a framework of just transition, but within that system system change frameworks. I think sometimes when people hear about just transition, maybe outside of our movements, it's thought about as just sort of taking workers from one dirty industry and replacing them in like a solar industry, and that's the whole of the change. But really, in terms of from its inception and now in practice, we think of just transition really in that same way that's being talked about, as a framework that's fundamentally at once oppositional and visionary. So it is about taking on and fighting to shut down the Marathon incinerator in Detroit, you know, fighting to hold and Chevron accountable here in Richmond, California, and you know, shut down the dynamics that are, you know, really having tremendous health impacts for the Laotian, Black, and Latinx communities here in the Bay Area. At the same time as building real alternatives. And I'm excited that Mia is going to be here talking on Monday about, you know, Cooperation Richmond, but that same strategy we're carrying out, you know, across North America, and it's part of a real global. It's part of the way the global movements also influence us. You know, when we look at the landless peoples movement in Brazil and what's happened out of like when you collectively hold space, similar to what Leah is talking about, we see that, you know, here in practice, maybe, you know, in various scales, but people really taking, you know, even the incredible work in Jackson, Mississippi of Cooperation Jackson, and building out, you know, what does economic livelihood look like for a huge unemployed Black communities across, you know, and I know Monica was just here talking about Mississippi as well. These are the dynamics we see. Empower Kentucky, incredible work happening. And they're in Kentucky where you have coal miners who've been displaced. The coal industry has, you know, we see already what happens. We can see the future of what's also going to happen with folks who are working in all of these extractive industries. Afterwards, those workers are dealing with incredible health impacts from the front lines of that work, and the communities also. And when we can find that place of shared struggle and build those economic alternatives. And I think that that's incredibly possible. And some of the strategy that we're doing to advance that right now, we do have a frontline Green New Deal movement, you know, so the Green New Deal, we're working with a broad range of forces, some of which are anti-capitalist and visionary and movements like ours, and some who are the full range of the Greens, but we see that frontline leadership really within there, helping to talk about, like, you know, part of the reality of the extractive economy is it's incredibly subsidized. Fracking is one of the most expensive things you could possibly do. I mean, it's unbelievable to look at the billions of dollars that we're giving to this prop up fossil fuel industries. And if we take the strategy of divestment and investment, there's incredible potential. And that also relates very deeply to the movement to defund the police right now. The movement that the Movement for Black Lives is leading around defunding police and investing in Black communities. It's an alliance strategy that if we can take on all of the aspects of, you know, kind of a comprehensive package that begins to look at, you know, a long-term strategy of, you know, shifting resources, shifting and building movement infrastructure. That's a lot of the strategy that we're moving on multiple levels. The immediate step I would point people to right now is the Thrive Agenda. It's a short-term, you know, it's an immediate step that we're looking at right now, but it just was launched yesterday by many of our movements. GDJ, CJ, and others are in there. The Thrive Agenda, and it's about trying to begin this push right now to say, look, if we're going to rebuild our economy, dealing with the tremendous crisis that we're facing post-COVID, let's rebuild it in a way that honors women of color who are essential workers, and the need for the care sector, you know, domestic workers, those who are taking care of children and elderly and disabled peoples. Let's invest in those jobs. Let's build out public transportation. Let's build out locally controlled, you know, as Leah's speaking about, you know, locally controlled renewable energy, but that's not a massive solar grid. Let's build those, you know, that local control of our own power. And that's the kind of thing that I think is the exciting strategy that we're seeing folks apply across North America and around the world.
Great. Well, we're in the last, you know, couple of minutes of our conversation. So I wanted to leave space for you all to ask each other questions or raise any insights that you wanted to bring forth in the conversation with one another in this last little bit that we have together. I don't know if Leah or Jaren, you have any burning questions or pieces that you want to pick back up and take a little bit further.
Yeah, maybe just a bit more on this, the failed strategies and the successful strategies. So we've also been doing an analysis actually of the 3,000 or so cases that we have. there's different struggles to see what are the different sort of repertoires of contention, what are the forms of mobilization that have been most successful at actually stopping unwanted projects. Actually we found, and this is research that will probably come out soon, but we are seeing that, disruptive strategies, economic disruption is very effective. And this includes things like blockades, as I mentioned, the creation of referenda, non-participation, boycotts, so on and so forth. So all of those, contribute to being able to stop projects. What we see that's not as sort of failed strategies is some of these attempts, I think, to speak in the language of power. So, for example, we look at one strategy, which is trying to value or put prices on the environment, called, economic valuation. That's actually, we saw that that's counterproductive. So it doesn't really contribute to stopping projects. And I think this also ties in, I think one strategy that is not very productive is this sort of discourses saying, if we just turn to renewables, life can continue as always, that we can, replace the fossil fuel economy with the same economy based on renewables, without really making clear that in order to deal with this crisis, we're going to have the need for much more fundamental changes and restructuring in our economic system and in our consumption practices. So I think that strategy of saying, yeah, we don't have to have these fundamental changes, we can just green the energy system, doesn't work. And actually some other research, because we also studied conflicts over renewable energy, including nuclear conflicts, dam conflicts, and solar, wind, so on and so forth. And this is another piece of research that's just about to come out, and it shows that these conflicts over that type of energy project can be just as disruptive, just as conflictive, and lead to the same levels of repression of environmental activists as projects, fossil fuel projects. So it's not really, greening the energy system is not enough. And we often talk about degrowth, the need for degrowth of the economy. And degrowth is sort of a catch term for, as you mentioned, how do we move towards an earth-based economics, a feminist economics? How do we fundamentally rethink the economic system? And I think there is a hunger, and that people are more receptive to that idea of, rethinking how we work, rethinking how we consume and how we produce. And that's really when we talk about disruption, it's, unsettling and disrupting people while you're offering sort of this new, more radical alternatives to them.
I love that. That's excellent. And I'm sure we're wrapping here. I think I would just say, the only other thing I would also love to bring in the mix, and entirely built, like, I love everything Leah just laid out as like the fundamental alignment. I feel that I think the other piece that maybe we just didn't mention today and probably came up in the earlier session is that I think, especially in North America, it's important to keep the presence of the legacy of this movement, especially the shoulders that we do stand on that have made tremendous gains. And so I think it's important always for folks entering into this to study the Hermes principles, to study the principles of environmental justice, the letter to the Big Ten. Like there's a tradition here that is led by, these ideas that people speak for themselves, that 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 is unusual, I think, to have that level of recognition and power that's come from Tom Goldtooth, Pam Talley, you know, like Connie Tucker, like all of these different folks who built this movement, who gathered this movement, but to then it's a constant struggle. So we still have like, you know, this dynamic of you know, sort of a power dynamic within our movements. And I think it's reflected in this, in a positive way. The New School here is inviting in, you know, folks who are connected to frontline movements. And I'm, you know, even conscious here being, you know, kind of a white organizer inside this struggle and being a part of it and connected to it. But I think that those practices and those documents are living tools around power inside of our movements. And I think that we have to keep those alive. We have to keep shifting resources toward those who are most impacted. And we have to keep lifting up that there is a learned legacy that we build from, because I think it's very active right now in this particular political moment. There's a real shift, and we can begin to center these rising movements that I think are reflected across these 5 days.
I think that's a beautiful place, coming back to our roots and the legacy of the movements that we're learning from and continue to build from. So this is a good point to, we're going to bring in Viveka to help us give us some instructions for how we're going to do our little break and the breakout rooms.
Great, thank you all. Yeah, that was really wonderful to hear, and very hopeful, and also sharp. That's a great combination. Yeah. So we're gonna move into an opportunity to have small group discussion to keep the conversation going. And we know that on this event, there are a lot of you that are grappling with these questions in your own ways, right? And we actually have a large number of folks working in EJ, connecting those dots and doing that work. So in the discussion, we have 2 prompts that we're going to invite. And first is just to hear what's resonating for you. You know, what were some of the things that you found interesting, things you agreed with, or something that sparked disagreement or generative, like creativity about, oh, well, what about this, right? And then how might U.S. environmental justice leaders, movements contest with global systems? So that's digging deeper into that. We want to have embodied practice and practice the kind of way of being now that we want for everyone. So we're going to thrive and take a 5-minute break. Yeah, and come back in 5 minutes. So my request for you is that if you're going to stay for the breakout groups, please don't leave the meeting, because that's how the breakout groups are going to be set up, are by folks that stay in Zoom during the break. And if you're not going to stay, we request that you then leave the meeting now so we can set up the groups. And last thing is, in the chat, there's a shared Google Doc we'll be using if it helps you to have a little spacious time to open that sometime before we come back. All right, so enjoy your break, take care of yourselves, and thanks to our guests. We'll see you soon. Folks, as you come in back into the space, if you want to chat your, note takers could chat your insight and question into the chat box for us and send it to everyone. Welcome back, welcome back. So feel free to turn on your videos so we can see folks, and note takers, if you want to chat in the chat box, an insight and a question, that'd be great. And happy Friday, everybody. We're making it work. So as that chatting's happening, and I'm curious, what were you all?
Yeah, we had a really,
right?
Yeah, we had a great, productive, continued our conversation in our small breakout with Leah and Jaron and Sujatha as well. And, you know, got to dive in a little bit more on the role of protests, in particular in the US, and the internal and external role that it can play in disrupting systems, but also in building culture and building out those narrative shifts for folks in the movement itself. So, you know, maybe before we go out to the questions, I'll invite Jaron and Leah to share any little tidbits from our conversation that you thought were really generative, and add to the richness of the conversation we had earlier. You know, we got to talk also a little bit about, like, I think giving us hints as to the kinds of capacities and infrastructure that we could help support in the EJ movement for contentious strategies that are sometimes dangerous and risky, and but can be productive. You know, or we can just turn to questions too, if you want to just go straight into the Q&A.
Speaker's choice. Do you want us to share a question, or do you have something top of mind you want to tap of heart?
I mean, just, yeah, well, some of what we were talking about, I think that's interesting to share is a little bit about, you know, Sujata was kind of asking, you know, is protest become too performative, in a sense that the authorities know, you know, follow the script. So it's just become sort of a scripted way of doing action. And we were discussing, how do we move outside of that script? What are the different ways? So one is, you know, this contentious action or disruptive action. When is that possible? And how, you know, how do you do this sort of contextual analysis based on who your targets are, what the political forces are at the moment of, you know, what the reaction might be to that type of action, or how does even progressive governments that you're sympathetic with, how might they foreclose the possibilities for more contentious action? So you're sort of holding back from doing that sort of disruptive action. And then the other thing we talked about a bit was the role of art and narrative in doing creative disruption and creative activism, and talking about different fun examples of artivism. So we were talking about, I was telling this story in Spain about that groups of grandmothers were doing like nap-ins in the protest. So they would bring like their blankets and pillows, go to the protest and take a collective nap. So this is different ways of, you know, recreating the protest experience. They don't need to be that risky. I remember one of the first big protests I was at against the WTO in Prague. It was led by this, like one of the streams was led by this a group of samba dancers, and the police were way more afraid of people dancing than people doing anything else. You know, dance and music is really what scares them, probably a lot more than any sort of violent or more confrontational action. So how do we play within those spaces?
Okay.
Yeah, and I would love to hear from y'all. I'm excited to see some folks I know here. I was telling folks, Michaela Curry's here, who led a really badass action in Spain last year when folks walked out of the COP. But also, I think the piece I would just love to hear from y'all too is I think there is something personally transformative when you do get to take those kind of riskier actions with a set of people, and you get to experience that sense of power of like, hey, you know, we have to be creative, we have to get past the security line, we have to do this thing, and then you do it and you realize your own potential, and it's there's no losing that, because you get to experience it in a lived way. And I think that is different from a march, and is incredibly important for our movements. But I'm just excited to hear from the groups and just to get to know some of the folks on the call. So
okay, cool. Well, maybe I'll just highlight a question, and if the person who feels like a connection to that question wants to elaborate at all, because I hear that there's a desire for hearing from folks here too. Yeah. So there was one about, I love this, about global timing and cohesive disruptive strategies. So yeah, can we hear more about what that means to the group that posed that?
I think that was my group. We were just talking about how, that this has to be like a huge global movement, obviously, and like a lot of our work also has to be like very locally ingrained, like in the sense that like the communities being affected by a particular issue are the best equipped to address that issue. So we need to like be very like in sort of like our local space, but we also want to like think globally about, as a US citizen, some of us, like how the US, like the US role and in the world, and like how it has destabilized other countries, and also, the way that the US contributes to climate change in a much more drastic way than a lot of other countries. And also we were talking about the fact that Stephanie, I think she brought up she works in toxics, and she brought up the fact that even though like DDT is banned here, we still produce it and like ship it to other countries. So we're still having those effects across the world, even if we're not feeling them ourselves. So just kind of about like, how do we balance our local work, but then also, build this global movement with people that we don't necessarily like know or come into contact with on a daily basis.
I don't know if Jaren, you want to share any insights you have about how your members connect their local place-based work to these larger frameworks and think about the dissipating effects of sometimes even our solutions can have in the global context.
Yeah, I do think that there, I do think that just even having that intention around that work, I think that the best, expressions of internationalism happen when we are kind of locally rooted in our place of struggle, so, and then able to make those connections. But I absolutely think we experience over and over again that folks are, there is a strategic significance of being rooted in the belly of the beast here. And so I think that the movements that we're doing that are both that hold that perspective and just having that consciousness is incredibly important. And I think that there are a lot of times where we can lift that up in practical ways. So, we have been able to more recently, for example, sometimes we can be indirect. Right now, just shared communication, with, like, we did an exchange between some of the leaders in the movement for Black Lives and some of the leaders in Chile, just to bring up that example again around sort of like that moment of like folks talking about, they saw the real similarity of those struggles. But also there's like practical things happening around Brazilian indigenous movements and being directly impacted by the offsetting policies that are happening with like California cap and trade, for example. And so we've been able to bring Chief Ninawa from Acre in Brazil through working really closely with the Climate Justice Alliance and the Indigenous Environmental Network, making those connections. And I think that where we see that, our policies do have direct impacts. I mean, the market stuff, which we, all of those market mechanisms, we really can see directly. Chiapas, we talked about in the beginning, 1994, and the Zapatistas. Unfortunately, California, Palo Alto right now has an offsetting program in Chiapas, that directly is displacing indigenous peoples. So sometimes where we can make those direct connections, also we can be in shared struggle. But I think it's a great question to be in, and I'd love to even, figure out ways that we can be supporting building those connections for folks. And creating, even inroads for when there's calls to actions. Like right now, there's a big call to action happening from the Garifuna community in Honduras, where a lot of land defenders have being disappeared. And so sometimes just those straight solidarity actions, there is also spaces for that as well. I don't know if that's helpful to the questions y'all were asking.
I feel like I could add a little bit just from what we talked about in our group to that, is like I guess one of our questions is like, what does it mean to move beyond incrementalism on a global scale? And like I think so much of what you're saying, Jaron, makes sense and like is what's already ongoing. And I think what maybe like we can take advantage of that maybe we're not like maximizing is the technology available to us, and having exchanges between global communities that are impacted by the same circumstances, like people that are impacted by mining in different global communities, and sharing strategies in the way that we see, you know, military forces sharing strategies and things. And I think, you know, it's really ambitious and optimistic, as I was saying in our group, but I mean, that's also what we're here for, right? Is to be ambitious and optimistic for the future that we want, and like globally timed interventions that are disruptive and what that looks like. Which I think, you know, is really obvious. And then when you get into the logistics of what that looks like is like much more complex. So that was one of the things that we were kind of circling around at the end of our conversation about like what those strategies would look like.
I'm curious if you got any hints of what those strategies might look like.
I think we needed more than 7 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or if Leah, if you want us to add anything too on strategies that you've seen in like looking at all those thousands of conflicts that you've studied, you can feel free to share.
I mean, there's definitely, I've seen some amazing things happening through transnational organizing between organizations, just information sharing, doing research together. I mean, one example that was really powerful is this group called Foil Vedanta that have been UK based and originally formed to work against a mining project in India, the Niamgiri mining project that was eventually cancelled in a landmark case, but then, you know, beginning to become involved in other mining conflict in Zambia. And essentially, you know, leading to Vedanta being kicked out of that country as well, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of examples of that, of how this, you know, this sort of alliance building happening at different scales. And I think the important thing to keep in mind is the flip side of that, of when we organize to stop environmental injustices in our communities, to be aware that they're not being displaced to other communities. So we were visiting with a community in Bulgaria that didn't want cyanide being used in a gold mine. And the company was saying, yeah, we have this new technology. We don't need to use cyanide. And we found out that the ore was going to be shipped to Namibia to be processed there. So what would the local environmental impacts be in that case? Or if a project is stopped locally, is it just being displaced to more vulnerable and more marginalized communities? I think those are some of the questions we can keep in mind. And then I think also just being aware of the moments of, you know, when you're being really defensive, you might not have the energy or the capacity to do as much the global work. And what are the moments when you can devote more to the transnational organizing? And then I guess the last thought is the humility aspect of seeing it as a really non-hierarchical, reciprocal exchanges. So not necessarily assuming that in these relationships, you know, activists from developed economies hold different types of power. How do we kind of be aware of the types of power we have and what also we have to learn from, you know, our allies in other countries? I think those are some of the insights to keep in mind.
Yeah, and then we have one other question that asks, how do you use moments between disruption to build? So we're hearing some examples, think of that and what you were just saying, both of you. But yeah, wondering what is it, what's the capacity that allows this transnational connection and organizing, right? Or yeah, what allows this to be possible? Yeah.
I think the most important piece, the kind of groundwork of it is organization, is building that kind of trusted set of organization, because then, you know, I think folks are often looking for us, but it takes time to have trust, you know what I mean? So part of how GGJ has been able to even build over 15 years is by that consistency of relationship with these other movements. And then, so we're able to then link in our members that are kind of locally rooted folks. And so in some ways, it's like the more we build up that fabric of this grassroots organizing sector, the more we're able to be in relationship to each other. And, you know, we see that in different contexts, that there is that social movement structure. And I think we're just trying to really continue to really build that inside North America. But as we have that, we can then be in direct relationship. I mean, right now we have a feminist organizing school happening inside of GGJ it's an international feminist organizing school, and it's cutting across, I think, 13 different countries. It's in like 6 different languages. But, you know, the way that we can have folks in Palestine, in Mozambique, you know, in Guatemala, you know, and a small crew from North America in relationship to each other is that we exist in organized structures. And so in some ways that locally rooted organization is the kind of starting place of how we then build up networks, and we're in shared articulation, shared space that we can then be in relationship for that like long-term part of that global movement.
I think we're at our just a few minutes to wrap up here, and I want to take a moment just to thank our guests, Jaren and Leah, for sharing their passion and insight and experiences with us on this important topic, and all of you for taking a little time out of your Friday to also be in conversation with us. We're very grateful for that, and we want to encourage you to join our last 2 sessions in this series. So shameless plug here for all of you to come back. We're going to have a back-to-back session here because on Monday we'll be returning to a conversation to continue this thread about the capacity for the movement to employ contentious strategies in the EJ movement here in the US. So I think we have a slide that gives you the details for that. So I encourage all of you to please share with your networks and rejoin us on those 2 sessions that are coming up. And then we have a final session on the 25th about how we're going to fund the revolution, right? How are we going to get the resources and be really in conversation around funding disruptive strategies, which are often the least funded and the least attractive, at least to philanthropy. So please join us, and thank you so much. If you want to learn more about the fellowship or the work we're doing, you can you'll receive an email where you can sign up for updates. So look out in your email inboxes for that. And appreciation to all. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful Friday.
Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you.